pay for your student pilot training. But first, let's determine if you truly want to be a pilot. Not because you can differentiate between a Boeing and an Airbus, or you are an average aviation enthusiast, means you will like being a pilot as a career. The two just doesn't translate. I suggest you first determine if you truly want to be a pilot. My reason for saying this is due to the expensive nature of the journey you are about to embark on. If you have access to a great deal of finances, that is to say money is not an issue, then by all means you can pursue it as a hobby. If on the other hand you're someone like myself who has access to extremely limited financial resources, then you should only begin this journey if you are absolutely 100% without a doubt sure that you want to be a pilot as a career. Obviously, having not done it, it is difficult to determine whether or not you will actually love it. For this reason, in my previous video, I suggested you get a 4-year degree that is non-aviation related. Let's assume for a moment that you are someone like myself who discovered early on that you truly love aviation and you do want to pursue it as a long-term career and not just a short-term goal. How do we go about paying for it? Your first option is to ask your parents. If your parents do have access to some financial resources, then you may be able to convince them of your desire to be a pilot and to pursue it as a career. This is important because unlike traditional college where you can spend 1 or 2 years studying a particular major and decide you no longer want to pursue that major, you are able to transfer some of those classes into your new major. Aviation training or pilot training is not like that. The money you have spent to become a private pilot and into your instrument pilot gives you a lot of skills and a lot of knowledge, but that skill and knowledge is not transferable into other industry. Some may argue that you can use these skills if you choose to become an air traffic controller. I don't believe so, simply because your depth of knowledge, your depth of understanding of the national airspace system, how it works at that stage of your training is extremely limited. You need to make sure this is what you want to do, and you will hear me say this many times throughout this video because it is expensive. I am talking somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000 depending on where you go for your training. Your second way of paying for your flight training is to get a job. You can work and pay for your flight training at the same time. However, this is only a viable option if certain conditions are met, and those are: you have just entered the workforce, meaning you're between the age of 18 and 23, you're still living at your parents', and you don't have the burden of having to pay rent, a cell phone bill, and other associated utilities. If that is your situation, then you may be able to find a decent paying job and use some of your after-tax income to pay for your flight training. Yes, this is challenging, but it's not entirely impossible. If on the other hand, you do have the burden of rent and utilities to pay for, it makes it extremely difficult, almost impossible, to pay for those things and pay for your flight training at the same time. The third option available to you, and the one I did, is to join the US military. There, after 4 years of positive, and I emphasize positive, enlistment, you have access to the GI Bill. But first, you have to pay into the GI Bill in order to have access to it. The GI Bill will not pay for your private pilot license. It will only pay for your instrument, your commercial, and your multi-engine training. And even then, it will only pay 80%. You have to pay the additional 20%. The third way you may be able to pay for your student pilot training is through the federal loan program. I mention this because it's worth exploring. When I tried to get federal student aid to pay for my flight training, they were not allowing us to use it for that purpose. The rules may have changed, so it is worth looking into. And finally, you can get a regular loan. If you have a good bank with a good interest rate and favorable repayment terms, then you can get a student loan and pay for your flight training that way. You can also explore a combination of student loan and you paying for it by yourself. Let's say your monthly salary after taxes is $2,500. Remember, you have just entered the workforce, thus you're not making a great deal of money. You can, and assuming you're living at home with your parents or you have roommates, you can dedicate probably about 25 to 30% of your after-tax income to pay towards your flight training, making up the rest of your flight training costs with a student loan. Some schools even go as far as encouraging students who don't have access to a great deal of money to pay for their flight training, but have a genuine desire to pursue piloting as a career, to work alongside their trained mechanics and to keep the plane clean and sometimes fuel the planes also with the appropriate training. In exchange for that labor, you are allowed to fly the plane and you are allowed to sit with an instructor. This is a long way of becoming a pilot, but it's a viable way for someone who don't have access to a great deal of money. You have to make sure, I will say this again and again and again, you have to make sure you want to be a pilot. You have to. It's just way too expensive to waste a lot of money on. It's way too expensive to get halfway through it and decide, I no longer want to do this. Your parents, if they're paying for it, is going to be really, really upset. And if you took out a student loan to pay for it, you still need to repay that loan. It is a lot of money to just throw away. Make sure this is something you want to do before you take on such an expense. Alright, that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions or comments about anything I've said, leave it in the comments below. And I think that's it for this one. I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Until then, be good.